Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Intersectionality and Interrupted Learning, the Impact of Adversity Trauma on Academic Achievement for Latinx Youth. Today we are accompanied by our presenter, Dr. Porsch from the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science, University of California, San Francisco. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay. Just to remind everyone, this presentation was prepared for the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center under cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we like to note that the MHTTC network uses affirming and respectful recovery-oriented language in all its activities. This and accepting of diverse cultures, healing-centered and trauma-responsive, inviting individuals participating in their own journeys, first and free of labels, non-judgmental, avoiding assumptions, as well as respectful, clear, and understandable, and it's specific with our actions, policies, and products. This concludes today's webinar. Go ahead for our next slide. We wanted to talk a bit about today's presenter, Dr. Michelle Porsch. She's an assistant associate professor at the University of California, San Francisco, in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. As a developmental psychologist, she has studied the impact of adversity on academic achievement for young children and adolescents, primarily using mixed methods approaches. Her early research studies included the investigation of the impact of parent involvement in life circumstances of families on the language and literacy development of children and adolescents. Recent work has included the high school dropout, school engagement, and retention and grade. Working with interdisciplinary teams, she has also studied the association between trauma and substance abuse for adolescents related to mental health and academic outcomes, as well as a focus on immigrant children and families, with specific attention to the impact of trauma on resettled refugee youth. Go ahead with Cindy.
I'm sorry. Can I do the question? Sorry, didn't hear you.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and read the poll questions. Okay, the first question, which of these are considered adverse childhood experiences? And your options are going to be having a parent with substance abuse, experiencing physical abuse, experiencing racism, or all of the above. Okay, so as we can see, 97 said all of the above and 3% said experiencing racism. Our next question, excessive stress from adverse childhood experiences can cause, and they have symptoms that appear as behavioral problems, depression and anxiety, trouble with concentration and memory, or all of the above. And as we can see, everybody said all of the above. Our last question, Latinx students are more likely to receive special education services in separate class settings, as accommodation in the regular classroom, or from school resource officers. And for this question, we got 64% in separate class settings, 29% as accommodation, and 7% from school resource officer. That was our last question, so without further ado, I'm going to leave you with Dr. Porch.
Great. Thank you very much. So I just want to start out by saying I have no conflict of interest in this presentation. Nothing to report. And also just to note, I've included a few photos of murals that are in the community where I live. I'm in the Mission District in San Francisco, and that's a historically Latinx community with a lot of Mexican American families and a lot of families from Central America. Okay, so just to give you an outline of what I want to talk about today, I'll first review disparities in educational outcomes for Latinx and other minoritized youth. I'll be telling you about theoretical frameworks and research in the field of child development, and I'll highlight a few of the studies that I've conducted that are really designed to illuminate the systemic influences of educational outcomes. One of my primary interests is understanding how trauma and adversity can disrupt or interrupt a child's educational trajectory. And, you know, I think about all children as capable of learning and thriving, and really that families overall support this learning and have high aspirations for their children. And this line of inquiry really comes from work I did in my initial doctoral studies on a longitudinal project where I saw that children who were really academically strong were still like failing in school. And I became really interested in what else was contributing to poor educational outcomes. And, you know, really what I found was that significant life stress and mental health were important and often overlooked factors. And finally, I want to, you know, conclude this talk with a bit of a look at overlooked strengths of minoritized children. And I use the word minoritized here, as others have done, to reflect that Latinx children and other children of color are not only are they not usually numerical minorities, but it's really that they are treated often as less than. So, and there's a reference to a very good article in the reference list by Soto Santiago about that. I'm doing two things at once here, so here, okay. So one way I want to start is to call to attention the different educational disparities for Latinx youth. And one of the things I focused on a lot in my work are dropout rates. So they're disproportionately higher dropout rates for Hispanic Latinx youth, as reported by the nation in the nation's report card. These numbers are from 2019. So in the United States, all Latino boys, that rate is about 9.3%. For girls, it's 6%. But when you look at combined all boys, in the U.S. it's 6%, and all girls it's 4%. And there are similar gaps in reading and math proficiencies, but you'll see I'll talk a little bit more about dropouts. And one thing I want to call attention to is the way dropouts are recorded in school records. Researchers have begun to have a wider conception of this as leaving school. So that includes actively dropping out, but can also reflect being pushed out, often for youth with chronic absenteeism, which could be due to helping the family with childcare or having to work or other things that are going on in their lives. One thing we really don't know from these national rates is intentionality. We don't really know why youth are no longer in school and why they aren't receiving a high school diploma. There's a really good report out of America's Promise called "Don't Call Me Dropouts." Don't call us dropouts, because using qualitative interviews with kids, they're talking about the many reasons they're no longer in school, but a lot of them are really saying, we didn't decide to leave. There were other reasons where we might have gotten pushed out. I have a forthcoming paper with researchers from UCLA, and we really describe a framework that we call the social determinants of disparities in educational outcomes. And this is built on Nancy Krieger's framework of social determinants of health. So that work, which is over 20 years old, is explaining what's going on with health and illness that is really not individually based, but it's more centered in neighborhood conditions, economic resources, access to food, shelter, healthcare, exposure to trauma, including community violence, racism. In this, particularly also thinking about this for kids in school, police brutality, immigration trauma, illness, and loss due to COVID-19 in the last few years. I want to include here especially this impact of COVID-19, not just for students who've lost time in the classroom and who've had to move to virtual learning, but to the consequences for children whose caregivers are frontline workers and more susceptible to exposure to COVID-19. Currently, the estimates are that approximately 200,000 children in this country alone have lost a parent or caregiver. So these children are experiencing a traumatic loss, which certainly interferes with learning, and there are significant psychological consequences, and there'll also be long-term material consequences. And this is not disconnected from historical bias in this country and in the educational system. And finally, thinking about what's going on to explain these educational disparities are disproportional and exclusionary discipline practices that are often experienced by Black and Latino youth. So I want to talk about a few different theoretical frameworks for explaining these different educational outcomes. And one that's been really important in my work is Cynthia Garcia Coll and her colleagues' Integrative Model of Developmental Competencies in Minority Children. So this is a theory that explains educational outcomes by factors that are situated in a socio-economical ecological framework, and I'll go into that a little bit more. That there's really consideration of what promotes and what inhibits children's outcomes, and to really consider not just internal processes, but environmental influences that can have direct and indirect effect on academic outcomes. The importance of this framework is that when Cynthia Garcia Coll and her colleagues wrote it, it centered examples using Black children and Puerto Rican children in the U.S. mainland to understand social stratification within a white mainstream society, which was, a very different framework than what is usually used in developmental psychology. By doing that, it really emphasized the importance of looking at racism, prejudice, discrimination, oppression, and segregation as factors that influence the development of the child and the family. And it also stressed the protective role of families and culture for child development. So really understanding the strengths that families bring. And once we consider the many systemic and sociocultural factors, we can move away from explanations of educational disparities that are really a deficit model, that assume lack of intellect or interest in education, or that assume that families aren't supportive for their children's educational achievement. So I'm going to read through this and you'll have the slides. But, it really starts with understanding social position, race, class, ethnicity, gender, and the way this moves from left to right. The theorists are describing how each of these constructs influences the next, and how the model itself hypothesizes these as explanations for what they call developmental competencies, so cognitive ability, social and emotional strengths, linguistic ability, and strengths in being able to navigate various cultures and being able to cope with racism. So when you think about these social positionality, that affects whether their children are experiencing racism and prejudice. Segregation is also an important piece. Communities are often segregated and then go to schools that are themselves segregated. Thinking about promoting and inhibiting environments of schools. Is the school supportive? Are the neighborhoods safe? Is there health care available? And then thinking about adaptive culture. Are there traditions and cultural legacies that are passed down? Thinking about acculturation and the stress of acculturation, and supportive cultural environments. And then this holds a small place for individual child characteristics such as age, temperament, biological factors. And I think when you look at some of the previous developmental models, it really, the individual child piece was so big, and there was so much less attention to all of these other socio-cultural factors. And then also thinking of the family, family structure and rules, family values, racial socialization. They're teaching children to be proud of their racial background and to have strength, and to think about having strategies to deal with racism. And all of this has an influence on the developmental competencies of children, as I noted before. So when we look at the US educational system, there are a lot of systemic bias, which disadvantages opportunities for children from Latinx background, and there are often fewer educational supports. We want to really start to think about what has been called the achievement gap as really an opportunity gap for kids who are in under-resourced schools, have teachers that are less likely to look like them, have limited access to linguistically and culturally sensitive or responsive curriculum. And this systemic bias really increases the risk of disproportionality in special education, and in more higher likelihood of harsh disciplinary practices. And one of the things I want to argue as we work through this is understanding that if we miss the fact that a child may have learning differences or may have experienced some trauma events and needs some other supports, if we miss that and we interpret their behavior as being not interested or disrespectful or defiant, they end up in receiving discipline instead of the accommodations or supports that would really help them succeed. So one of the things we want to look at is just the historical inequity in our educational system. And, to begin with, this is a country where it was against the law for enslaved people to learn to read or write for hundreds of years. So even after the Civil War was over and there was an end of slavery, there were still very limited educational opportunities following Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws. So, where it was once against the law to learn how to read, it's now against the law in a growing number of states for us to know the history of this discrimination, of slavery, and of the discrimination and treatment, not only of the, through slavery, but also of the native people of this country and of every group that has migrated to the U.S. or has been colonized by the U.S. So, this is the context in which, children are learning. So again, part of this history of Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896, that it ruled that separate but equal was okay, and that was until 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education decision that ruled that separate is fundamentally unequal. In 2001, federal legislation of the No Child Left Behind Act was supposedly a way to address disparities, but what it did often was penalize under-resourced schools. And then more recently, the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 moved from a federal structure to discretion for ensuring equity to the states, which is, they're not fully reinforced across states as we would hope. So this background is just to consider the laws that reinforce inequities in our nation's school system. So in this context, we want to, really understand what's going on for minoritized students in poor communities. In the 1980s, zero tolerance became the primary response to this war on drugs. So there was a real move towards automatic suspensions and expulsions, which disproportionately affected Latinx and other children from minoritized backgrounds. There was a rise in surveillance in schools. You began to see many more metal detectors, and a real rise of police presence in schools through the hiring of school resource officers and deploying them across schools across the country. When that happened, there was again an increase of juvenile justice incarceration for minoritized youth and for students with disabilities. And there was recently more work to look at, what is the outcome for schools with school resource officers. Not necessarily, they don't make schools safer, and they actually make it harder for kids to learn and thrive in those conditions. Most recently, the Los Angeles Unified School District really replaced a lot of school resource officers with social workers to help support Black education achievement for the Black students in that school district, and that's been actually initial results showed that it really has raised achievement. But in this context, there's often, as I said before, a use of a deficit model to explain underachievement. Not all of the socio-ecological factors that Cynthia Garcia Coll pointed out, but a more simple explanation that, well, these kids just they just don't have the ability, and we know that's not true. And one last thing I want to talk a little bit about is the role of colonialism, because we often have students who have migrated from U.S. territories, including Puerto Rico, and also colonialism is really the history of the settlement of the United States. And that started with taking over land that was, of the, Native Americans. So there's a history of genocide where we had 150 million people to now 250,000 Native, down to 250,000 Native Americans, and a current population of about 5 million across the country, taking of land, so that almost all the land that was owned by Native Americans it has been taken away by really through settler colonialism, and so you have people restricted to reservations, which has really created changes in community and home family relationships. Part of that work was taking away the ability to transmit culture by separating children from their parents and putting them in boarding schools. This idea that adoption was for the good of the child, but it's really a traumatic family separation and an intergenerational trauma. And more specifically to the Latinx students that we're considering today, thinking about the impact of Spanish colonialism in Puerto Rico for almost 400 years, that the U.S. Took over Puerto Rico as a territory after the Spanish-American War, and Puerto Rico became a Commonwealth in 1952. But to this day, it's neither a state nor an independent country, and that has implications for the way education is run there. And for how kids are seen here on the U.S. mainland. And I'll talk about some outcomes in a little bit. So there are material and psychological risk factors for this repeated historical process of colonization. So some of it is psychological, and this internalization of low self-worth. But there's also control through miseducation and denial of culture, in taking, most clearly in Native American culture, in taking kids out of the family, but also in suppressing culture across many groups and what gets taught, suppressing what gets taught in the classroom. And again, there's with intergenerational trauma, there's a higher rate of substance abuse, PTSD, suicide, and depression that you can trace back to this intergenerational trauma. I just want to call attention to David and Nadal, two Filipino psychologists who've done a lot of work on the psychological consequences of having a colonial mentality. And for that, individuals who are higher in that, on that scale, have a higher denigration of the self, a denigration of their own culture or body, like shame or embarrassment. they're more discriminating against less, within group, against less Americanized in-group members. And, there's a higher tolerance for this historical and contemporary oppression. And this is associated with more bullying, acculturative stress, and maladaptive behaviors. So, this is a significant piece to pay attention to and think about in clinical work. So when you think about resistance to colonialism, it's not just psychological. It's important to think about, local laws and governance, representation and self-determination. That there's, we also think about bringing back the more cultural, spiritual, emotional practices that are really important for mental health. And I, again, call attention to Tuck and Yang's article really about the way we were talking about decolonization is not just a metaphor, but it really is about, making right what was wronged through losing property rights and sovereignty. It's really about, can we really share that power? Can we give back land that we took? Can we give back self-governance that we took away? So again, some things to consider in thinking about the context that kids are in school in. So, and then one last theoretical piece I want to look at is intersectionality. So we're not just looking at, one way of describing groups, but we're thinking about intersecting layers of oppression that can be used to conceptualize how these multiple social identities that kids carry have an influence on their health, their access to care, educational resources, and well-being. One of the ways, I looked at this with colleagues and students was looking at experiences of intersectionality that have an impact on assessing risk and protective factors for depression for minoritized adolescents in the United States. Attention to experiences of discrimination was really important. We looked at different studies and we really rated studies as being very high, more sophisticated, if they were not just describing comparative group differences, for instance, that boys are more likely to drop out of school than girls, or that Latinx youth have a lower graduation rate compared to white students, but using conceptual frameworks of gender and expectations of masculinity and femininity and how those are an influence. And I'll give you an example in a second. And instead of describing race as just a demographic variable, to have more sophisticated frameworks of experience of racism and discrimination and how racial socialization can support resilience. Often we talk about, we use the word race when we really should be using the word racism. Like that's really what's going on. It's not just a group affiliation. It's about how you're treated as a particular group. In this, let me move to this. So in the review article, again, there's a reference for it in the reference list. The collective findings point to the importance of using an intersectional lens for understanding how different mechanisms work for having youth at risk for depression. And, again, our ability to identify cultural and developmental protective factors. And this is important for thinking about what interventions and what sort of treatment would be helpful. So just, I'm going to give you a few examples of some of the articles that really talked about intersectional identity and positionality for the Latinx samples of youth that were in these studies. So this first one by Lorenzo Blanco and colleagues found that the highest risk of depression was for boys that reported the highest levels of discrimination, and for those boys that had limited acculturation in either US culture or Latino culture. So they lacked a connection to either culture. And then on the other hand, the lowest risk of depression was for girls with strong social support and who experienced little acculturative stress, like they were comfortable in both cultures. This second study showed that while boys had lower rates of depression overall, adolescents who perceived American culture as interfering with family cohesion and who anticipated more discriminatory experiences had a higher likelihood of depression. So, in this context of, strained psychological conflict, aspirations, and attainment gap, one of the things that was going on was the additional pressure for girls to conform to conventional female roles at home, and then going to school where there is these expectations of female empowerment and freedom and independence. So that strain really added to the risk of depression. And in this final study, as an example, there were looking at bicultural stress, so negotiating two conflicting cultures and expectations at home and at community and at school. So the higher the level of family stress, the higher the odds were of suicidal ideation, and that was worse for girls. So for girls, there was an enhancement of this stress being between two cultures, and a higher likelihood of depression and a higher likelihood of suicidal ideations. For boys, they were less likely to feel that stress, so better well-being in comparison to the female peers. So, and one, just to think about intersectionality, we want to think about institutions and organizations that support a child's development and how they're patterned in intersectional ways. So one of the things we want to consider would be services to support learning and diagnosis of learning difficulties and diagnosis of mental health problems. Some children might be considered for accommodations or treatment, and others more likely to be ignored. For instance, we think about dyslexia. One of the ways that which is a reading language-based learning disorder, one of the ways that that's identified is having reading skills lower than you would expect. One of the big problems in that vague way of describing that is that for Latinx and Black children, there is a low expectation of reading. So those kids are often missed, and therefore missing services that would really help them in their educational attainment. And dyslexia, the estimates are, maybe 1 in 5 kids has some kind of trouble with reading, depending on, how broadly or how specifically you define those reading difficulties. And then the other thing that goes on in thinking about intersectionality and educational policies, again, really this harsh punishment, which is more likely to happen for boys than for girls. Boys more likely to end up in juvenile justice. Though newer research is looking at perceived teacher discrimination and harsh discipline and more of a push out for minority girls. So unfortunately, the increase is towards more punishment overall, and that includes girls experiencing this more and more. And again, just to summarize, when we think about how social identities work together in these structural systems, you have privilege, social identity, and oppression, and these all work together in different ways. So, there'll be, in some cases, identity or a system may provide some privilege, and then in other times it may be oppressive. So just to look more at these individual patterns. And let me find my mouse. All right, so now to the real piece of it. What gets in the way of academic success? And I want to pull all of these things together now. Academic trajectories often are influenced by adversity and trauma experiences, and we think that I think, and a lot of other researchers think, that happens through the way they impact mental health. And they do this within a context of inequities in this educational system. And I'll go through, how these different adversities have different risks for kids: being retained in grade, being less engaged in school, more likely to have an IEP, and more likely to drop out. And this works, differently for boys and girls, with this idea of immigration or not immigrate, not having immigrated or migrated, and the way that racism works in this. So quickly, I'll go through adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, were first conceptualized over 20 years ago, and with specific specific experiences of emotional, physical, sexual abuse, neglect, domestic violence, household member with substance abuse, a household member with mental illness, an incarcerated parent, parental separation. And there's now really a second wave of understanding ACE research, which includes atrocities of war, community violence, bullying, racism. And there's expecting that this cumulative exposure has long-term physical ailments like heart disease and diabetes, but also significant psychological distress, which we talked about, depression for youth, but also I'll talk a little bit about substance use, and for children, this can have a real impact for academic struggles. Let's see. Just to give you a sense of how prevalent these are, and these results were from the National Survey of Children's Health, which is a population-based study, representative sample. You had the lowest was 4% had kids whose parents had died. I expect this to be a lot bigger the next time they do this survey. They do it about every 2 or 3 years. The most common instance was parents who were divorced or separated or living in circumstances where the family faced financial hardship. And kids could report more than one of these, and they often did. So we look at high rates of trauma exposure. That survey, that was having a representative sample of over 90,000 children. Over half in that study had experienced one at least of those 8 experiences of adversity, and about 10% had experienced 3 or more. And these adversities affect the caregiver and the child. They add to parenting stress, and there's an indirect effect of stressed out parents, like also may be having harsh parenting. It really interrupts the child's ability to thrive and to demonstrate self-regulation, and that is a real impact on school performance. However, some protective factors are having neighborhood support as a buffer to stress, and that also is found to support student outcomes. Having an adult mentor is also really important for lessening parenting stress and supporting the child. And then in another study where we looked at ad health data, we found that, again, the importance of having a supportive adult in the child's life to ameliorate some of these risk factors for a school dropout specifically. And one of the ways I want to look at this is how these factors, how ACEs really has an impact on academic outcomes. So one of the primary mediators is through child mental health diagnoses. So children who've experienced higher number of ACEs, more susceptible, maybe more vulnerable to anxiety, depression, PTSD, and that has an impact on school engagement, whether or not they have an IEP, which could also be for psychological support, or being retained in grade. Caregiver mental health is also a really important factor for children's academic outcomes and neighborhood safety for school engagement and IEP. So really needing to look at this constellation of factors, again, thinking back to Cynthia Garcia Coll's model for understanding children's competencies. So when we think about the impact of adversity and trauma on cognitive processes, specifically, the main point is that toxic stress can really change the brain. It has an impact on the child's developing brain. So the younger the child is in experiencing these, potentially the bigger the impact. So it isn't something that just makes kids feel bad. It actually has a physiological effect on their brain development. So it can affect memory, concentration, cognitive processes. How does it do that? Maybe some studies showing increased cortisol, increased inflammation, this change in physiology in the brain. We're doing some work with the ABCD data set, which has MRI data on over 10,000 young adolescents. And again, looking at that data with the neurology group, we're seeing some changes in white matter. So now the push is really to understand that these sorts of adversities, it's just not psychological, but it's really impacting brain development. Thinking about psychological processes, as I said, you have, more likelihood, greater vulnerability to PTSD, depression, substance use. One of the things about substance use is it may be a self-medicating strategy, a way to forget what's going on. So we need to keep that in mind too. And then another important point is only about 10% of youth with mental health services with mental health diagnoses receive services. And then these aren't always evidence-based, and more rarely are they culturally sensitive and linguistically matched. So, we have a big gap in kids needing care. For this study, looking at correlates of high school dropout, I used the Collaborative Psychiatric Epidemiology Surveys, the CPS, which Dr. Maggie Alegria was one of the primary investigators of this study, and it included nationally representative sample of African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Asians, Latinos, and non-Latino whites. We found a dropout prevalence of 16% overall, but it was, for the whole sample, but it was much higher for Black and Latinx youth. One of the things that was important about this study is that it was youth 21 to 29 who were retrospectively reporting their experiences. And we could see in this community sample, the dropout rates were much higher because they were really reporting on what they did in school, which I think is somewhat more accurate than school records. We found that experience and timing of migration was really critical, that youth who arrived in the US as adolescents had the highest rate of dropping out. And then let's see, go back. Let me go quickly just to give a sense of the sort of experiences we were looking at. In this study, we weren't using the ACEs, but we were looking at trauma experiences that were reported. So some of the biggest ones that were significantly related to dropout were natural disaster, the ones in bold, child abuse, being beaten, being raped, and witnessing domestic violence. And in this population, 38% had experienced one or more of these traumas. When we looked at childhood DSM-4 diagnosis, this is a little bit of an older study, so they were using the DSM-4, not the 5. Almost a third had reported at least one childhood diagnosis of disorder. Most of the, so we had 4% with PTSD, 6%, so almost 7% with substance abuse, and 11% with conduct use disorder. Of those, only 17% received mental health services as a child. When we look at, how does this work? Childhood trauma was directly related to dropout, but the primary mechanisms to explain what's going on is this substance use and conduct use and conduct disorder. Again, thinking that these are two things that really interfere with being at school, being engaged in school, and conduct disorder is really a path on this school to prison pipeline. When you think about psychologically how ACEs interfere with learning and achievement, in the classroom, children can have a fight or flight experience. Just not being able to pay attention because, they see the setting is dangerous, the way that these kids are in San Francisco going down this hill, where it might be really steep. An example of this, a really good example that a clinician told me about was working with a child who always had difficulty in math. And after many sessions with her, and really was able to identify that she had a significant sexual abuse experience when she was learning. It was at the same time she was learning these hard math concepts. And so that stuck with her. So it took a long time to disentangle those two, that experience of trauma with this experience of learning. But in math class, it always made her very difficult for her to concentrate and attend to that lesson. But you can imagine behaviors like that can, teachers can think of them as something that needs to be disciplined, rather than as really understanding, how to support the child. And then more recently, we're doing some analyses using the Boricua Youth Study data and looking at dropout rates for Puerto Rican youth in two different sites. One is in the South Bronx, and one is in metropolitan San Juan, Puerto Rico. You see almost twice the rate of dropout in the South Bronx. So, I'm, thinking about this as a context where kids are seen as othered, less, they're not going to have as many teachers who look like them. They're going to have a more significant experience of racism. We found for both, there's absenteeism for both sites that was part of the association for leaving school. Neighborhood conflict and familialism was a risk factor for students in Puerto Rico, which we think the familialism was more of like a connection and taking family responsibilities, which might have had some students not be able to attend to school as much. And in the South Bronx, being older in grade level, probably being retained, but having externalizing factors were externalizing behaviors were real risk factors for students dropping out in the South Bronx. So one of the important things is to think about resistance to these adversities. So one of the things we need to address are microaggressions, racial microaggressions and discrimination in K-12 settings. And again, a reference to a qualitative study we did looking at how students in an urban high school setting were experiencing messages about their inability to do well in math and science, that self-efficacy, a new study that's forthcoming about self-efficacy, social support, and having internal strengths really mediate the impact of trauma on grades for girls. Again, thinking about this intersectionality. Again, a reference to a study we did looking at STEM outcomes for first-generation immigrant children, and finding that they not only had higher grades in the sciences, but also higher aspirations. So thinking about these, going against some stereotypical ideas about who is or is not capable of doing well in school. It's really important to increase teacher representation to diminish racial bias and increase support for minoritized students. Students who have a teacher who looks like them, understands them, supports their culture, those kids tend to do better in school. So again, we need to think about how we recruit and support those teachers. And that we, for many of the counselors that are here today, really thinking about re-envisioning and destigmatizing school-based mental health. And this study is a reference to a study we did looking at a sports-based group therapy intervention in Boston. So urban school settings where kids had experienced significant trauma, and this intervention used DBT to really help kids think about, be self-aware, help with their self-regulation. And the fact that it was a sports-based intervention, really made kids want to do it, and they, didn't feel like they were being pulled out for therapy. So I know that was a lot and quickly, but thank you very much. And we can go to questions if we have some time.
Sure. We have two of them as of now. The first says, I am curious to hear more about how bilingual immersion programs help in addressing these issues caused by colonization.
That's a great question. I'm working with Lillian Duran, who is faculty at University of Colorado. And, I think some of her research is really understanding family supports for literacy. And that, I think bilingualism, that is, bilingual programs that are developed by people who, are themselves bicultural, really understand the strengths of multiple cultures and can build that into the curriculum, I think can go a long way in that support. I don't think all schools really give it the thoughtfulness and support and design that it really requires, and that really uses evidence to understand what works best for kids in a bilingual setting.
Thank you, Dr. Porsch. I'm gonna go ahead and read the other question because we just reached our time.
Okay.
This one is about an article you mentioned earlier, intersecting identity and positionality of Latinx youth. And the question is if it includes any of the impact of phrases such as calladita se ve más bonita.
I am not familiar with that. And I will admit to not being myself fluent in Spanish. Can you translate for me?
Oh, sure. It's probably I'll butcher it, but it's basically you look prettier in silence.
Okay, thank you. Well, that really does get it. You know, the gender pressures for girls, right? I have a friend who, you know, was discouraged from going to medical school, though her brother was, because her father said that's not a pretty career. Like, so there is like that idea of what is conventionally suited for girls versus boys, and it's very constricting, right? So, and for boys too, they are also confined to things that are, you know, traditionally masculine. So in those studies that we looked at, we didn't have those, I didn't come across that phrase, but definitely came across those ideas of really what is the socialization around how you're supposed to be or feel or think as a girl or as a boy. And in fact, have also done some research looking at the mental health implications. It's really bad for your mental health to have those constrictions, those constraining ideas about how you're supposed to be, and found a higher incidence of depression for girls who, you know, had been socialized or felt that pressure in that way to be silent and pretty. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Porsch. We don't have any more questions as of now, so I want to give you the opportunity to close or say anything before we go. But before that, I just wanted to remind everybody that tomorrow we also have another webinar on culturally responsive trauma-informed and evidence-based approaches for supporting Latinx adolescents with SUD. Feel free to look it out on our webpage. I've been added links to the chat also for the survey, which is really important for us because it's how we get measured by all these awesome webinars. And I think we got another comment. Oh, they're thanking you, Dr. Porch. They say that it was very informative and interesting. I don't have anything else to say, so I'm going to leave it up to you and then I'll close it.
Okay, so two things. Just thank you for being here today. And of course, like, you know, the references I hope will, you know, really be informative. But a lot of what I did today should really set up the talk that you just mentioned, which is, if it's Dr. Lisa Fortuna, we collaborate a lot. And so hopefully this provides a lot of information about school context, and her talk tomorrow would really give you a good understanding of, you know, approaches to treatment and therapy that would support kids. I mean, and in the end, we really want to support all kids thriving, but especially kids who experience the oppression of discrimination and low expectations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Porch, and thank you, everyone. Have a great day.